seems our lives are lived on screens rather than in physical space. Since our big television monitors up here post all the lyrics, most people don't use the printed hymnals anymore. But in the back of those hymnals is a collection of readings and poems and prayers and meditations. It's especially impactful because we don't have a single identified sacred text or canon. So that collection is a really wonderful compilation of the ideas that make us who we are. Since I grew up as a UU, I've held one of those hymnals in my hands for a very long time. This week I realized I think the children's chapel at my church had the precursor hymnal to this one. But for a long time, my favorite reading in there has been what we heard a minute ago, "To Live Deliberately" by Henry David Thoreau. Those words from Thoreau capture a sense of vitality and excitement about the world that I appreciate. As the quintessential transcendentalist, Thoreau's writing also resonates with our first source of Unitarian Universalism. We come to know truth and the sacred through each of our direct experience of that mystery and wonder. The foundation of our faith is each person's experience of the sacred and finding their own truth through their own heart and mind. The Transcendentalists were a pretty intense people. For them, thriving was about having purpose. Life was about exploring and knowing the world deeply. And not just intellectually, it was also about the experience and knowing through emotional and spiritual engagement, directly witnessing the full spectrum of life. I've spoken about Thoreau's influence some in the past. He's most known as the author of Life in the Woods, an account of his experience at Walden Pond. He aimed to create a uniquely American literary style. And his essay on civil disobedience laid the foundation for nonviolent resistance as a successful strategy. It's kind of a precursor to Gandhi and King. His influence on our world has been enormous. Thoreau was famously friends with his older mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, essayist, lecturer, philosopher, abolitionist, poet, and a Unitarian minister for a short time until he gave it up. Emerson sort of led the Transcendentalism movement in the mid-19th century. He was a champion for individualism and critical thinking and pushing back against the pressure of society to conform. Nathaniel Hawthorne was also among these transcendentalists. You know him as the author of The Scarlet Letter. His several other novels also warned against the dangers of conformity. And those are the names that are probably most familiar. Theodore Parker is probably the one that I find most inspiring. His sermon on the transient and the permanent in Christianity kind of set the course of Unitarian departure from Christianity back in 1841. In that sermon, he identified that the core truths and that sense of abundant universal love of the Christian message was what it was all about, that even without the church or the Bible or that person of Jesus, that those things would be true, and that that was what our faith life was all about. That our primary mission was to help one another grow in intellect and moral capacity. And that's what we've kind of been about ever since. Later, he shifted his focus to slavery and our fragile American democracy. As an outspoken abolitionist, he hid fugitive slaves in his own home against the Fugitive Slave Act. He was indicted for those actions but never convicted of it. He also raised funds to financially support John Brown, who many considered a terrorist. After Brown's arrest, Parker wrote a public letter arguing for the right of slaves to kill their masters and defending Brown's actions. Theodore Parker's name isn't terribly well known, but his legacy lives on in the particular phrases of Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. Now, not surprisingly, the women transcendentalists are even lesser known than their male counterparts. I was delighted to learn this week a little bit more about Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. She was an early American educator who opened the first English language kindergarten in the United States. Long before anyone else, she embraced the wisdom that children's play has intrinsic developmental and educational value. Now, don't you dare dismiss her as a sweet lady who played with kids. Elizabeth Peabody had a tremendous grounding in history. She read extensively in 10 different languages. In 1840, she opened the bookstore that held Margaret Fuller's famous Conversations, and she published the books of Nathaniel Hawthorne and others. She was an abolitionist and led efforts for the rights of the local Indians. And for a final twist, Elizabeth Peabody was the first translator into English of the Buddhist scripture, the Lotus Sutra, from a French version. What a wild and wonderful life. Margaret Fuller, the woman probably most associated with transcendentalism, was a journalist, editor, critic, translator, and women's rights advocate. She became the first editor of the transcendentalist journal, The Dial. That same year, she joined the writing staff of the New York Tribune, which was highly unusual for a woman in that time. By the time she was in her 30s, she earned a reputation as the best-read person of any gender in New England and became the first woman allowed to use the library at Harvard. Her seminal work, Women in the 19th Century, was published in 1845. It's considered the first major work of feminist writing in the United States. Susan B. Anthony and many others cite her as their inspiration. A year after writing Women in the 19th Century, she was sent to Europe as the first American female correspondent journalist and full-time book reviewer in journalism. After all that, though, she got a pretty raw deal. She was treated poorly by Emerson and the other transcendentalists, likely because she was a really intense person and made some life choices that they thought odd. Shortly after Fuller's death, her importance faded. Immediately after her death, the editors that assembled her writing and her papers censored and altered much of her work. It's taken really 100 years for her full brilliance to resurface and be appreciated. These were amazing people, this circle of friends. They managed, in Thoreau's words, to live deeply, to suck out all the marrow of life. I don't suffer delusions of grandeur. We will not copy these intellectual giants. But we do need heroes to aspire to. I need heroes. And heroism isn't necessarily about accomplishing some great task. It's more about showing up and trying. The real story in the struggles of those folks that I mentioned, the real story is in their effort, their struggles, not just what they accomplished. Their heroism, especially for the women, was in not shying away from the challenge. That's why I love that reading by Thoreau. It's not about winning or results. It's about a commitment to engage with the world. making a choice, and investigating how it turns out. More and more I've heard conversations about the inability of millennials and Gen Z to do tasks that older generations find quite common. Perhaps they can't use a rotary phone or drive a car with a manual transmission. Somehow it's okay to point out that millennials don't know how to use older, rare technologies. It's not quite as acceptable to point fingers at our seniors and their sometimes willful refusal to engage with newer technologies. Just so we're clear, I am on the senior side of that equation. About 10 years too old to be a digital native. I'm much more comfortable writing in cursive and writing a check than I am with artificial intelligence or automating my calendar and my emails and my apps to all talk to one another. I imagine some of you are thinking this stuff has little to do with generations. This is about a willingness to learn things. And that is true. Regardless of our generation, there is a tremendous value in self-reliance. It was one of the trademark values of the transcendentalists. And self-reliance isn't just about building a fire or whittling your own utensils with a pocket knife. It could be addressing an envelope. It could be using voice-to-text technology or even artificial intelligence to speed up some of your tasks. There is value and virtue in digging into the world to strive and learn new ways of doing things. Self-reliance has gotten a little bit of a bad rap in the past decade because it is mistaken as a rejection of interdependence and community. So perhaps I want to go out on a limb and say something unpopular in today's culture. There is value to physical endeavor and intellectual rigor, cultivating deep friendship and romance, technical skill, artistic ability, pursuing excellence and achievements doesn't have to impose hierarchy or diminish anyone else's worth. After all, the main focus of these transcendentalists and their lives was recognizing the inherent goodness and potential in every person, regardless of race or gender or ability or class. Now, most of us find some way to dig into the challenges of life, to suck the marrow out. And that particular combination of challenge and reward isn't always obvious to people on the outside. I've come to learn that several Tapestry members have either been sailors themselves or come from sailing families. Sailing is often wildly misunderstood, perhaps for good reason. A very large part of it is boring. Another part of it is physical work that is exhausting, dirty, and frustrating. There's a useful phrase among boat owners. They talk about boat yoga. That refers to all the terrible positions that you have to contort your body into to fit into the small spaces where repairs are required. Boat yoga is nowhere near as glamorous as it sounds. I'm sometimes hesitant to talk about sailing or owning a boat because it sounds glamorous. Well, I spent my day off last week repairing and reinstalling the head. That's the toilet. And that is, by the way, in a very small and awkward space. That's all to say nothing of the weather. My unscientific guesstimation is that about 1/5 of the time the weather cooperates for a pleasant experience. That means that 4/5 of the time It's either dead calm, requiring a very loud and very slow engine, or it's blustery and takes serious work to stay safe. About 1/5 of the time it cooperates. But when it does, sailing provides an experience like little else I know. It is dancing with nature, connected between the force of the wind and the graceful, fluid motion of the ocean. It's blissfully quiet, as the power of the wind enlivens thousands of pounds of boat to glide effortlessly. On a perfect day, there might even include the company of good friends, a beautiful sunset, pods of dolphins escorting your journey. Sometimes it is absolutely magical. With that magic in mind, we learn to put up with the possibly enjoy the challenging, uncomfortable, gross, boring aspects of it. Backpacking is a very similar arrangement. The magic comes through in short moments, like sunshine through the trees. Those are my types of high effort, cut a broad swath, chasing the richness activities. But this kind of effort looks different for different people. Different things that would make me say, really? You did what? Why on earth would you spend your time and money pursuing that? Some people are chess masters. Michelle Antonessi is a pie baking champion. Literally, she wins blue ribbons at the county fair with her pies. Roger Green has reduced his mileage, but he was a very serious marathon runner for years. One of my ministerial colleagues is a dedicated actor, taking on 2 or 3 major roles in community theater every year on top of his ministry. The effort is different for each of us. It could be learning to play a really difficult piece of music or being part of an ensemble that pushes you. Several people have tackled their fear of public speaking by jumping up behind this very pulpit. The goals change with age and stage of life. I was gobsmacked last year when a tapestry member who I know has never backed down from a challenge in her life welcomed the physical and cognitive challenges of aging. She earnestly said something like, I really look forward to what this phase of life has to teach me. I really look forward to what this phase of life has to teach me. It's one of the many times around tapestry I have thought, wow, I hope to have that kind of grace one day. Loving deeply is a risk. Sharing yourself is a risk. Cultivating the skill and the will to sit quietly in meditation is a risk. Inviting a pet into your life that you know you will outlive. Raising children that you hope will one day leave and be their own person. Choosing a career, gaining skills to change careers, or finding a new identity in retirement. Facing the world sober, ending a broken relationship, or fighting like hell to keep your marriage going. All of those moments of challenge are also our opportunities to know the world and ourselves in more genuine ways. It's not easy, but our world is beautiful and rich. Every minute is unfolding with new possibilities. Unitarian Universalism often doesn't appear to outsiders as a religious community. Even within our congregation, I hear people wonder, why do we call this weekly gathering worship? We're not focused on a God out there much of the time. But we are pausing to praise the gift of life that is all around us, the opportunities to live and love, the miracles that are so easy to fall asleep to. So we come here to remind each other of the goodness that is in our midst. That is the transcendentalist spirit alive and well in our tradition today. Well, we also join together here to remember the limits of our own individualism. Gathering together, we're able to remind each other and to see more broadly that beautiful gift that is available in our days. Thank God we have friends to call on and to learn from. Thank goodness we have traditions from the past that hand down the insights of ancestors to help make sense of this big, infuriating, challenging, wonderful gift of life. Amen.